Religious persecution, a demonic 9-year-old,
and the great outdoors.
I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. During the early modern period, the hunt for witches was rife within Europe, and estimates put the number of accusations and subsequent executions in the tens of thousands. One of the most famous examples from our shores, and one with a legacy that endures to this day, is that of the Pendle Witches. And for a bit of a switch up to make things more interesting,
here I am out on Pendle Hill, out in the wilds, to show you some of the spots relevant to the story. I fancied a hike and I knew this video was next on my list, so I figured why not add a bit of flavour to proceedings. I do want to do more on-site stuff in the future, time, weather and geography permitting, but let's crack on with the witchy stuff. Back to you in the man cave, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Before I discuss the actual story of the Pendle Witches, I think it's very relevant to discuss the circumstances at the time, namely in three particular categories: the persecution of Catholicism, what witchcraft really was, and the key families of the Pendle area. Starting off with the persecution of Catholicism, just under a century before the trials came the English Reformation. Following a trend of Reformation in Central Europe, the Church of England broke away from the rule of the Vatican. Famously, this was because Henry VIII wanted to divorce so he could shack up with Anne Boleyn, but it was much more than that. For many years, people were beginning to feel the authority of the Pope was stretching a bit too far, and theologists began to argue that the superstitions of the Catholic Church were unnecessary guff when true Christianity was following the scriptures. Thus did England become Protestant, though many Catholics still valued their own faith and honoured the Pope, to the point where decades of unrest and religious genocide took place. After Henry died and following the brief reign of his son Edward, his daughter Mary took the throne. Her reign was also brief, but boy did she put the work in. A devout Catholic herself, she spent 5 years as queen trying to undo what her father had done and executed a great many religious dissenters. For Catholics and Protestants, the shoe was on the other foot. But then she was followed by Elizabeth, who was devout Protestant and undid everything Mary had done, and she was succeeded by James, who was also very Protestant, and the Catholics again had to face many years of religious persecution. As such, religious belief was a touchy, sometimes deadly conversation topic even amongst friends and neighbours, and those who wished to practice their banned religion had to do so in deepest secrecy. But unfortunately, this led to a bit of a treacherous trend within the people of England, where accusations of heresy and apostasy was rife. Beginning with people who genuinely believed that practicing a banned religion was sinful, it quickly devolved into an excuse for people to score points in a grudge or earn the favour of the monarchy.
Do you hate your neighbour? Rejected by the woman you fancy? Local reeve getting a bit too big for his boots? Then why not try accusing them of Catholicism?
But the early modern period also saw accusations of witchcraft spread throughout Europe seemingly follow a similar trend of earnest, if somewhat deluded people starting it, only for malicious chancers to embrace the idea further. In Britain, James I wrote a book while he was a prince called Demonology, which went into all sorts of detail about the evils of black magic and how to identify witches. At the time, witchcraft acts had been in place in both England and Scotland for several years, and a year after James took the English throne, the English Act was amended to make it a bit fairer, removing burning at the stake as the method of execution, except in some circumstances, and granting the accused the right to a criminal trial. So what was witchcraft viewed as? Folklorist Ava Potch, in her book Between the Living and the Dead, lists 4 categories proposed by historians. a person caught practicing either positive or negative magic, a wise person or healer who has lost the trust of a client or local authority, a person who may or may not have any affiliation with magic but has managed to annoy their neighbours, and a person whom local legends claim to be practicing witchcraft or occultism. The first two are ones to keep in mind because the belief at the time was magic fell into two categories, positive and negative, or the more common, white magic and black magic. While the laws about witchcraft never really laid out a difference between the two, and the religious doctrine of the time was that all magic was evil, because unless you're Jesus, the only way you can perform magic is to be taught by the devil. But as a whole concept, someone performing white magic was tolerated, if not actively praised in some places. Despite some advances in medicine of the time, access to genuine medical treatment was a rarity, especially in rural towns and villages far removed from the glamour of the city. Belief in superstition and tradition of passing down old remedies and ancient practices, however, was certainly not a rarity, and as such many local areas still boasted healers or practitioners referred to as cunning folk or wise people. We still have those today, we just call them Holland and Barrett. In the areas these people tended to operate, they weren't just tolerated, they were necessary. As I said, access to actual medical practitioners was slim to none in rural areas, so many people had no choice but to ask the wise woman for help in not fancying their manservant. Instead, the distrust for magic was against those who were to practice black magic in efforts to do harm to people or to cheat or steal from them or turn them into a newt. Anyway, let's get local to Pendle and look into the local healers there.
The two key families of the Pendle area, the ones most embroiled in the saga of the witches, are the Demdike and Chattox families. The former, headed up by Elizabeth Southerns, locally known as Demdike, who was very well known in the area as a practicing witch and seems to have been the local area's go-to wise woman. The latter family was headed up by Anne Whittle, otherwise known as Mother Chattox, and it's believed by some that her family were competing cunning folk. There were also some accusations that a few years earlier, members of the Chattox family had broken into the Demdike family home, Malkin Tower, and stolen goods worth a whopping £1, which in today's standards equals to around £264, or for the Lancashire folk out there, about 420 Eccles cakes.
Lancashire at the time was seen as a bit of a lawless free-for-all, both for religious dissent and also use of witchcraft, and it's speculated that the two families were making a decent wedge of money in their white magic businesses, unregulated by the somewhat idle law enforcement in the area. Our boy Ronald Hutton, in his 2017 thesis The Witch, says that these white magic practitioners were sometimes denounced as witches, but seem to have made up a minority of the accused in any area studied. It seems as though the Pendle Witch story is an exception to that rule, but then it's an exception to others as well. In 1612, in an effort to curb the aforementioned religious lawlessness in Lancashire, King James gave an order to the many Justices of the Peace, a title for a common law officer in a local area. They were to make a list of everyone they believed to be a recusant, basically anyone not showing themselves to be good church-going Protestants, in a bid to sniff out any pesky Catholics that might still be in hiding. The Justice of the Peace for Pendle was a man named Roger Nowell, and he began his investigation into the local area when he was brought a complaint from a travelling peddler named John Law.
Law's complaint was that the eldest granddaughter of Demdike, Alison Device, had met him and his son Abraham on the road to Trawden Forest. There she asked for some metal pins from John, an ingredient thought to be used in love potions. Records are conflicted as to whether she was offering to pay for them or was begging for them for free, but Law refused her for reasons we don't know. She then told the peddler she'd put a curse on him, walking away only to see him stumble and fall a few moments later. Many historians believe by unfortunate coincidence that Law was suffering from a stroke, though there are of course no medical records, or any indication as to what it was. Maybe it really was a curse. Some versions of the story state that the devil appeared before Alison as a black dog, offering in English to make law lame for her. According to Alison's younger sister Janet, who we will get to later, this was a spiritual familiar her grandmother had summoned, which the family called Ball.
Initially, the laws did not accuse Alison of witchcraft. In fact, it's recorded that Alison felt immense guilt at what had happened and had gone to see Law at his bedside to apologise and try to undo the curse. Then, according to the stories, either Abraham or John Law brought it to Roger Nowell when he began his investigations, or a guilt-ridden Alison owed up to it herself. Either way, Nowell brought Alison to appear before him on the 30th of March in 1612, alongside her mother Elizabeth and her brother James. Alison admitted to Nowell that she had sold her soul to the devil and had ordered him to lame John Law. Being the stand-up family guy that he was, James backed up his sister's claim by saying she had also admitted privately to him that she had bewitched a local child. There's no record that Elizabeth also damned her own child, nor is there anything to say she defended her either. But what she did do was drag her poor mother into the mix by claiming Demdike had a witch's mark on her body. This was a blemish on the skin, apparently from where the devil has sucked the blood of the bearer, proving that she had made a pact with him. Also during this questioning, the Chattox family were brought up. It's unknown whether this was down to Nowell wanting to cover all bases of witchcraft practicing families in the area, or Alison wanted to divert attention away from her family pointing fingers at each other, but it led to Alison accusing Anne Whittle, Mother Chattox, of murdering 5 men through witchcraft, including her own father John Device in 1601, and claiming Chattox's daughter Anne Redfern was also a witch. That is a lot of finger pointing for one meeting with a few family members, and while we don't have anything like a diary or family records that record their motivation, it's not hard to figure them out. King James's well-documented hatred of witches was no doubt common knowledge, as was the volume of death penalties that followed these accusations. While the Witchcraft Act of 1603 had thankfully removed burning at the stake as an execution method for all but the most severe cases, nobody wants to be hung either, so helping the court by identifying other witches might have gotten them a lesser sentence. Maybe like a mafia informant, they were hoping to get witchness protection. Shall I just go? Anyway, a few days later, 2nd of April 1612, Demdike, Chattox and Anne Redfern were called before Nowell to discuss the claims laid against them. The two family matriarchs, in a masterclass of why representing yourself legally is a bad idea, both admitted to selling their souls. Demdike claimed she had sold hers to the devil a couple of decades ago, while Chattox said that she gave her soul to a thing like a Christian man, whatever that means, in exchange for prosperity and always getting revenge successfully. It should be noted that both women were well into their 80s by this point, so potentially they were either too old to care, or they weren't mentally fit for the questioning, which is why they admitted what they did. Anne Redfern did not confess to being a witch. Good move. However, she was accused of making clay voodoo dolls either by Demdike or by her own mother, depending on which source you look at. There was also another witness called forward, Margaret Cook, who claims her brother had died of a sickness he blamed on Redfern shortly after falling out with her. After all the confessions were given, Nowell decided to commit 4 women, Demdike, Chattox, Redfern and young Alison, to Lancaster Jail awaiting trial for causing harm by witchcraft.
You'd think that was everything wrapped up and in the bag, except that Elizabeth Device decided the following Friday, the 10th of April, which was Good Friday, was a great time to have a meeting at the family home of Malkin Tower. I was going to visit and show you the site where Malkin Tower is thought to have once stood, but it would have added an extra several miles onto an already long hike, so here I am in a random spot instead.
There are some inconsistencies about what the meeting was for. In some sources it was a secret Catholic service for Good Friday, and I get that people back then were very committed to their faith. But you'd think with the law sniffing around and 2 of your family awaiting trial already, you'd avoid doing anything illegal, no matter how secretive you thought you were being. Other sources claim it was a meeting for the friends of the family to support the remaining unimprisoned family members and come up with some kind of plan to get them freed, with stories about Alice Nutter in particular saying the secret Catholic service was actually somewhere else and she just popped into Malkin Tower on the way. Of course, there's other theories that it was some kind of witches' Sabbath and the law were totally right to get involved. Whatever it may have been, someone tipped off Roger Nowell that it had happened, possibly the owner of the sheep James Device had apparently stolen to feed everyone, and an inquiry was held on the 27th of April that brought accusations and trial to 8 more people: Elizabeth Device, James Device, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, Jane Bulcock, John Bulcock, Alice Gray and Jeanette Preston. The good thing for us is that the record of the trials is very detailed and well kept. This is likely down to the 2 judges hearing them, Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley. Both had aspirations of earning some favour from the king, the former because he had been accused of a miscarriage of justice in his last witch trial and he wanted to enjoy his impending retirement without a stain on his record. The latter because he wanted to further his career by being promoted closer to London. The problem they had was that while James was openly against witchcraft, he also had a history of being very sceptical when it came to the trials. Perhaps understanding the malicious intent to which some people would employ accusations, he wanted things done right and thoroughly, and had even been known to get directly involved in exposing falsehoods in witch trial testimonies. So the judges didn't know which course of action would grant them James's favour, pulling the cases apart at the seams or being the men who brought down an entire coven. Their decision was to essentially do both, and thus began a long and, thankfully for us, thoroughly documented series of trials. Jeanette Preston was the first to be heard, and as she actually lived over the border in Yorkshire, she was sent to York Assizes for trial rather than Lancaster Assizes. Her trial was on the 27th of July and she was accused of murdering a local landowner, Thomas Lister. She'd actually already been on trial the previous year, accused of murdering a child by witchcraft, so she was on the court's radar already, and even though she had been acquitted, the earlier mentioned Witchcraft Act of 1603 did have a heavier-handed approach for people's second offences. Apparently, she had been taken to see the body of the man she was accused of murdering, and according to the records, written presumably by someone in dire need of a thesaurus, when she touched the corpse it bled fresh blood presently in the presence of all that were there present. James Device, in the inquiry into the Malkin Tower meeting, claims Preston was present, seeking the help of the group in committing the murder. She was found guilty. On 18th of August, 3 trials were held, and all were presented evidence and confessions that hold some scrutiny of likely being obtained through torture, but that's just how the law worked back then. First came Anne Whittle, Mother Chattox, who was accused of murdering Robert Nutter. She denied the claim, but her earlier confession was damning evidence, as was the testimony of a man, James Robinson, who lived with the family years ago and said that Chattox had, wait for it, turned his beer sour. Chattox confessed and begged God's forgiveness and wished to the judges to show mercy to her daughter Anne Redfern in her trial the following day. She was found guilty. Next was Elizabeth Device, who would have gotten away without trial if the Malkin Tower meeting hadn't happened, but instead faced 3 charges of murder. She claimed her innocence, but according to the records, the court was already against her due to her appearance. Apparently her left eye was slightly lower than her right due to a facial deformity, which had earned her the nickname Squinting Lizzie, or the court clerk's more generous description of an odious witch. The biggest damnation for Elizabeth was her 9-year-old daughter Janet, who, to be fair, rocked up and screwed over several of the accused. Elizabeth, when seeing Janet was acting as a witness against her, started cursing and screaming so much that she had to be removed from court. Janet said she believed her mother to be a witch and brought up the dog familiar Ball, with whom she'd heard her mother asking for help committing murders. She was found guilty. James Device was next, fresh from giving evidence against his mother that helped secure her guilty verdict, and while he also protested his innocence, he also had an earlier confession read out. Janet went 2 for 2 in saying she'd seen James asking the dog for help murdering someone as well. He was found guilty. The following day, 19th of August, the rest of the trials were held. Anne Redfern went first, accused of murdering Robert Nutter's father, Christopher. The accusation of her making clay voodoo dolls was read out, and witnesses were brought forward testifying she was even worse than Chattox. She denied her guilt, but was still found guilty. Jane Bulcock and her son John were next, again accused of murder by witchcraft. Both denied their guilt and also denied their presence at the Malkin Tower meeting, but Janet said both of them were in attendance and they were both found guilty. Alice Nutter came next, and hers was an odd one in that she made no statement beyond making a not guilty plea. She was also an odd one out. She was from a reasonably wealthy and well-to-do family, a contrast with the rest of the accused, and the only evidence against her was James's claim that she told him about a murder she helped commit, and Janet saying she was at Malkin Tower. It's an odd one, as a lot of the murdered people being used as charges were from Alice's family, so why would she bed in with all these other witches? It does highlight the actual motivations of this whole trial. Nutter's family were known Catholics, and 2 members of the family had already been executed as such previously. Even to this day, people argue this clearly shows Nowell's real reason for pursuing the trials was to get some anti-Catholic brownie points from the king. Either way, the result was as expected. Alice was found guilty. Next was Catherine Hewitt, another person in attendance at Malkin Tower, allegedly, and another whose only evidence was apparently telling James about a murder committed, and Janet pointing out she attended the meeting. She was found guilty. The penultimate witch we actually have no record of the trial for. Alice Gray's trial is not noted in the records, and she is incorrectly down as being a member of a different witch group on trial at the time. All we know is that she was the only one found not guilty, so maybe when the clerk published the records as a book, he omitted her trial as it mustn't have been very juicy. Finally, Alison Device was tried, and was the only one not actually accused of murder but just causing harm. In fact, her victim, John Law, showed up in court, and in keeping with the earlier stories about Alison's guilt, she apparently fell before him in tears and confessed. She was also found guilty. The only person who did not get to trial was Demdike, for an arguably merciful reason. She actually died in Lancaster jail while awaiting trial. All those found guilty were executed via hanging. Preston on the 29th of July at York Tyburn, the rest on the 20th of August at Gallows Hill in Lancaster. Of the 2 ambitious judges, Altham didn't end up retiring and actually continued to work until he died 5 years later. Bromley did get his promotion to move closer to London, although only halfway, as he went to the Midlands circuit 4 years later.
The aftermath I find most interesting is of little Janet Device. Only 9 years old at the trial, she seemed to be quite happy to basically condemn her entire family to death, though who knows what promises or threats were made behind the scenes that led to such behaviour. However, 22 years after these trials, another was held. 20 people accused of witchcraft, and one of those was a woman named Janet Device. Of course, there's no evidence to link them as the same Janet Device. Janet was a reasonably common name at the time, and the whole area was filled with Devices and Nutters and the like. But what if it was the same? What if Janet was the real witch all along, condemning her family to death, the price she paid for being granted power by the devil himself? Only for that power to lead her to the same fate, something very common in stories about people who try to make deals with the devil. What is especially poignant when you think down these lines is that the key witness of that trial was a 10-year-old boy named Edmund Robinson, who did later admit to making it all up, but caused the accused to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Maybe he was sent there by the devil to claim Janet's soul in the same manner that she originally sold it.
One thing to note is that throughout all of this, the Nutter family seemingly suffered a lot, either through being executed or murdered by witches. But fear not, the family lived on, and I know that because my other half happens to be a descendant of theirs, which is why if we ever meet someone with the surname Device, we run away immediately and tell them to get stuffed. The legacy of the Pendle Witches is extensive. Numerous books, films, TV shows, documentaries and the like have been made, whether they be factual deep dives into the story and the real motivations behind them, fictional tales of magic and mystery, or something in between that tries to bridge the gap between what was real and what might be.
The local area, as you might expect, thoroughly dives into witch fever. There are shops and artisans that both create and sell all sorts of witch-based memorabilia, including, most famously, Witches Galore, which is the white building you can see behind me. There are walking routes that take you through the historical areas of interest, from places like where we believe Malkin Tower to be, right through to Lancaster Assizes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'll pronounce it right in the main video. This isn't one of those routes, by the way, I just made this one up. Even the local bus is called the Witch Way, and if you're ever in the area or on the route between here and Manchester, you may well have seen the well-liveried vehicle in all its glory. Alice Nutter, of all of the accused, is possibly the most well-known, and as well as being a character in several fictional or history-adjacent novels and series, she has a statue here in her home village of Roughly. The result of a local campaign in 2012, she is the only one of the witches to be commemorated in such a way. Pendle Hill has also established itself as a haven for hilltop Halloween gatherings and generated all sorts of spooky stories of its own, including those of the witchcraft variety. The hill itself isn't actually featured in the story of the Pendle Witches, though it does serve as a great vantage point to see the area and villages in which our accused used to live.
But that's the thing. Were the stories inspired by the witch trials, or is the area a supernatural hotspot and a prime place for practicing magicians to bed down and sell their services? That concludes our discussion of the Pendle Witches and their enduring story. Was it just a bitter and deadly feud between two rival families that led to them both being wiped out? Was it a miscarriage of justice that acted as the latest in a long line of excuses for religious fanatics to indulge in their perverse attraction to violence against women? Or was it a masterstroke by a devil-worshipping 9-year-old who got her comeuppance in the end? It is notable that several people apparently bore witness to actual magic being performed, and especially notable that some people, like Alison, actually admitted to using devil-granted magical powers even when faced with the likely threat of execution. Maybe they really did make a deal with the devil and there was some clause in that contract that said if they denied it they would suffer a worse fate in hell than if they admitted it. Or maybe it's like that bit in Harry Potter in the History of Magic where the real witches admitted to it to mess with the muggles because they'd cast a charm to protect themselves from execution and they just thought it'd be a laugh. I've often said on this channel that magic could just be another physical process that we used to believe in but don't anymore. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and maybe there are still practitioners out there who work their magic more secretly after all the persecution their ancestors faced. Naturally, it's up to you how you choose to interpret and believe in the plight of the Pendle Witches, but as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in.
Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.